The morning Louisa Redford arrived in Brighton Falls, the sky was the colour of cold iron. She had travelled through the night on a hired coach that smelled of damp wool and old leather, her single trunk strapped to the back, her hands folded in her lap, with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned early that composure was its own kind of armour. She had not slept. She had spent the hours watching the dark Pennsylvania countryside disappear behind fog, pressing her thumb against the folded letter in her coat pocket until the paper had begun to soften at the crease. She had read that letter 47 times. She knew this because she had counted. The letter was from Northwick Steel, more precisely from the office of Mr. Jasper Northwick, though no one in Brighton Falls bothered with that distinction. Jasper Northwick was Northwick Steel. He was the blast furnaces roaring on the eastern edge of town. He was the rail contract stretching from Pittsburgh to Chicago. He was the reason Brighton Falls existed in the particular form it did. Its wide commercial avenues, its stone civic buildings, its copper-domed courthouse that caught the last light of every evening like a small, stubborn sun refusing to go down. Louisa had never been to Brighton Falls. She had known of it the way everyone in the state knew of it, as a place defined entirely by one man's will. She had not expected to end up here, but her father had died in October, and November had brought the creditors, and by the time December arrived, there was nothing left of the Redford name except the name itself, and a single outstanding debt that connected her family, with the cold precision of a steel trap, to Northwick Steel, $17,000, written out in full in the contract her father had signed in the spring of '87, 3 years before his death, without telling her, without telling anyone, as far as she could determine. It had appeared in the estate papers like a stone at the bottom of a river, invisible until the water was gone. The coach slowed. "Northwick House, miss," the driver called down. She looked through the window. The house sat back from the road behind a low iron fence and a row of bare elms that stood in the winter morning, like sentinels who had forgotten what they were guarding. It was large, not showy, but large in the way things are when they are built for permanence rather than admiration. Dark brick, 4 stories, symmetrical windows that revealed nothing, a house that had been constructed to last 100 years and already looked like it had. Louisa stepped down from the coach. She stood at the gate for a moment with her satchel in one hand, and the letter in her pocket and the cold air moving against her face. Then she went through the gate. The man who met her in the entrance hall was not Jasper Northwick. He introduced himself as Mr. Aldrich, the estate's house manager, a lean, silver-templed man in his 50s with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent decades making himself unnoticeable in rooms where important things were decided. He was not unkind. He was simply efficient, which in that house appeared to be the higher virtue. "Mr. Northwick will see you in the study at 2 o'clock, he said. "You're welcome to rest before then. The east guest room has been prepared." A young housemaid named Clara led her upstairs, past oil portraits in heavy frames and architectural drawings of bridges and mill floors mounted directly on the walls as though they were art, which, Louisa supposed, to the man who owned them, they were. The guest room was clean and cold and entirely impersonal. A fire had been laid, but not yet lit. The window looked over a long, formal garden stripped bare by winter, pale gravel paths cutting between dormant hedgerows like lines drawn on paper. She set her satchel on the chair by the window and took out the letter. She read it once more, not because she needed to, because there was a specific sentence near the end that she had to keep sharp in her mind, like a blade kept clean for a purpose not yet arrived. "The terms of settlement offered herein represent the final position of Northwick Steel and will not be subject to further negotiation." Final position. She had worked alongside her father's legal counsel for 4 years, long enough to understand that a sentence like that was not a warning. It was an instruction. It told you exactly where you stood and expected you to stand there without argument. She folded the letter. She had a piece of information that Northwick Steel did not know she possessed. She had found it 3 weeks ago, buried in the back of her father's correspondence cabinet, beneath a stack of receipts from '89. She had not yet decided what to do with it. She only knew that she would not arrive in this house without it. At 2 o'clock, she went downstairs. The study was at the far end of the ground floor. The door was half open. She knocked on the frame. "Come in," said a voice. The room was ordered the way working rooms are ordered, not for appearance but for use. Bookshelves on 2 walls. A wide drafting table near the window, crowded with rolled plans and surveyor's notes. A large oak desk at the center, its surface clear except for a single open folder, an inkwell, and a glass of water that had not been touched. Jasper Northwick was standing at the window with his back to her when she entered. He turned. She had heard descriptions of him, vague, mythologized ones, the kind that accumulate around powerful men and become more symbol than portrait. She had expected someone harder looking, older in the face, someone who wore his wealth the way some men wear a weapon, visibly, deliberately, so that you feel it before you understand it. He was none of those things. He was tall, with the build of someone who had done physical labor earlier in his life and hadn't entirely left it behind. His hair was dark and slightly unruly at the ends, as though he had recently come in from outside and hadn't thought about it since. His face was composed, carefully composed in the way that a well-drafted document is composed, nothing wasted, nothing offered that hadn't been considered first. But not hard exactly, not the face of a man who had made himself into stone, more like a man who had built very high walls and stood so far back from them that he had almost forgotten what the walls were for. He looked at her with the quick, clear attention of someone who read situations the way other men read ledgers. "Miss Redford," he said. "Mr. Northwick. Sit down." She sat in the chair across from the desk. He came around and sat as well, opening the folder in front of him without ceremony. "You reviewed the letter," he said. "I did. Questions?" "One," she said. "The position you've described, document keeper for the legal archives. It isn't a role that currently exists in your organization." He looked up. "That's not a question." "No," she said. "I want to understand what the role actually is." A silence settled between them, not hostile but weighted. "There are contracts in the archive," he said evenly, "that require organization and careful review. My existing staff lacks the time. You have 4 years of experience in legal correspondence from your work with your father's counsel." "My father was not a lawyer." "No, but he employed one, and you assisted that man directly." He closed the folder. "I research the people who come into my house, Miss Redford." She held his gaze. "Then you know the archive work is not the whole of why I'm here." Something shifted in his expression. Barely. A fractional adjustment, like a single degree of movement in something very large. Not irritation. Not deflection. Acknowledgement. "No," he said. "It isn't." He pushed the folder across the desk. "There's a contract inside, between Northwick Steel and your father, dated spring of '87. I need you to confirm your understanding of what he agreed to when he signed it." She opened the folder. She read through the first page, the second. She turned to the third, where the print grew smaller and the language grew more deliberate, the way legal language does when it is trying to accomplish something quietly. She found the clause on the third page. She read it twice. Her hands did not move. Her expression did not change. She had practiced this. The stillness. It had taken her years to build it, and she was grateful for it now, in this room, with this man watching her from across an oak desk, with the particular patience of someone who was very good at waiting for people to reveal themselves. She set the folder down. "This clause," she said, "designates a right of first claim on any secondary assets of the Redford estate in the event of default, including intellectual property and correspondence archives." "Yes." "My father's correspondence archives." "Yes." She looked at him directly. "You know there's something in those archives." He did not look away. "I know there may be." The fire in the hearth ticked quietly. Outside, a cart moved slowly down the street, its wheels grinding against the frozen ground. "Then we are not here to discuss the debt," Louisa said. "No," Jasper Northwick said. "We are here to discuss what happens next." He reached into the desk drawer and set a second document on the surface between them, thicker than the first, bound with a dark ribbon that had been tied and untied enough times to show the wear. "This is a secondary agreement," he said. "It supersedes the debt arrangement. You will remain in Brighton Falls for 1 year. You will work within the archive. And at the end of that year, the debt is cleared entirely, under the condition that any documents related to the original contract between your father and this company are turned over to Northwick Steel in full." Louisa looked at the document, then at him. "And if I decline?" "The debt proceeds to collection through the courts," he said, "which will take approximately 18 months and will cost considerably more than $17,000 by the time it concludes." She picked up the second document. She read it carefully. All of it, including the margins, including the footnotes, including the final line at the bottom of the last page that most people would have skimmed because it came after the signature block and looked like a formality. She read that final line 3 times. She set the document down. "I'll need a pen," she said. He handed her one without a word. She signed, and as she set the pen back on the desk and looked up, she saw something in Jasper Northwick's face that she had not expected to see. Not satisfaction, not the controlled pleasure of a man who had won a negotiation, but something quieter and considerably harder to name, something that looked for just a fraction of a second like relief. She filed that away. She would need it later. She had signed the agreement. She had given him her name on the line he had prepared for it. But what Jasper Northwick did not yet know, what no one in Brighton Falls knew, was that the document she had found in her father's cabinet 3 weeks ago was not in the archive. It was in the lining of her trunk, sewn behind the fabric with small, careful stitches, and it contained the one sentence that could bring down everything he had built. The first week passed the way cold water moves, slowly, steadily, wearing at the edges of things without announcing itself. Louisa had been given a small office on the second floor of the East Wing, adjacent to the legal archive room. The archive itself was exactly what Mr. Aldrich had described, and nothing more. Floor-to-ceiling shelving units filled with document boxes organized by year and contract number, the older ones grey with dust, the newer ones still smelling faintly of ink. A single window looked out over the side garden, a writing desk, a lamp, a straight-backed chair. She arrived each morning at 8 o'clock and stayed until the light failed. She did not see Jasper Northwick on Monday. She did not see him on Tuesday or Wednesday either. On Thursday morning, she was in the archive pulling the third box from the 89 shelf when she heard his voice in the corridor outside, not speaking to her, speaking to someone else, low and precise, the way he seemed to speak to everyone. She heard a second voice respond, then the sound of footsteps moving away down the hall, and then silence. She returned to the box. She was not sure what she had expected, some form of regular contact perhaps, some structure to the arrangement beyond simply being placed in a room with documents and left there. But the house ran on a rhythm she was still learning, and that rhythm did not appear to include her in any deliberate way. She was present. She was housed and fed. She was being paid technically in the form of the debt reduction. She was also in every practical sense alone. She met him properly on Friday, not by arrangement. She had come downstairs at 7:30 in the morning to request a replacement lamp from the kitchen staff, and she had turned the corner into the main corridor and nearly walked directly into him. He was already dressed, fully, precisely, as though the day had been ordered and the ordering had begun at 5 in the morning. He was carrying a folder under one arm and holding a cup of coffee that he clearly had no intention of putting down. They both stopped. "Miss Redford," he said. "Mr. Northwick, I apologize. I didn't realize you were—" "I'm always up early." He said it without explanation, as though it were a fact about the weather. His eyes moved briefly to the staircase behind her. "Is there something you need?" "A replacement lamp for the archive desk. The one currently there flickers. It makes extended reading difficult." He looked at her for a moment. "Speak to Mr. Aldrich." "I did yesterday. He said he would look into it." Something crossed his face, brief, functional. "I'll have it replaced today, thank you." He nodded once and moved past her toward the front of the house. She watched him go. He walked the way he spoke, with direction. No wasted movement, no glancing back. She turned and went to the kitchen. The lamp was replaced by noon. The second week brought a change in the routine, small but significant. On Monday morning, a note appeared on her desk, written in a hand she recognized from the contract signatures, spare, angular, each letter formed with the efficiency of someone who had written a great many things and stopped finding the act of writing interesting a long time ago. "Miss Redford, when you reach the 88 contract boxes, flag any document referencing the Callaway Bridge project. Do not remove them from the archive, simply mark them. No greeting, no signature." She read the note twice, then set it aside and continued with the 87 boxes she had been working through. She reached the 88 shelf by Wednesday afternoon. She found 4 documents referencing the Callaway Bridge project. She marked each one with a strip of red paper and made a note of their catalogue numbers on a separate sheet, which she left on her desk. The following morning the sheet was gone. She had not heard anyone enter the room. It was in the third week that she began to understand the particular texture of the house. Northwick House was not an unhappy place. It was not cold exactly, or unwelcoming. It was simply a house that had been organized entirely around the functioning of one person's professional life, and that person did not appear to have noticed, or had noticed and decided it was acceptable, that a house organized only around work tends to empty itself of everything else over time. The dining room was used for dinner each evening. Louisa ate there alone most nights, served by a quiet woman named Mrs. Hale, who moved through the room like a shadow, and asked no questions. Once she had asked Mrs. Hale whether Mr. Northwick typically dined in his study. "Most evenings, yes," Mrs. Hale said. "Does he have guests often?" Mrs. Hale paused in the act of refilling the water glass. "He used to," she said, and then she moved on, and the subject moved with her. Louisa did not ask again, but she thought about the answer for several days afterward. He used to. Past tense, spoken with the matter-of-fact weight of something that had changed at a specific point and had not changed back. She filed it away alongside the look she had seen on his face the day she signed the contract, the one that had looked like relief. On the 22nd day, she came downstairs at 9 in the evening because she had left a reference catalogue on the parlour table and needed it for the morning. The parlour was at the front of the house, just off the entrance hall. It was rarely used as far as she could tell, but when she pushed the door open, she found that the room was not empty. Jasper Northwick was sitting in the armchair nearest the fireplace with a book open in his lap. He was not reading it. He was looking at the fire with an expression she had not seen on him before, or rather with the absence of the expression he usually wore. No composure, no direction. Simply a man sitting alone in a room in the evening, looking at something that wasn't there. He looked up when she entered. She stopped. "I'm sorry. I left something on the table. I'll only be a moment." "It's fine," he said. She crossed to the table, found the catalogue, picked it up. She should have left. The room had a particular quality of privacy to it, not because he had said anything to indicate it, but because the expression she had interrupted felt like something he would not have chosen to share. She was almost at the door when he spoke. "How is the archive?" She turned. "Organized through 88. I'll begin 89 next week." He nodded, looking back at the fire. "The 89 boxes are the ones that will take time. I assumed as much. There's considerably more volume." A brief silence. The fire shifted. "My father started the company in 71, he said. Not as a revelation. More the way someone speaks when they are thinking aloud and have simply forgotten to think quietly. By 89, we had 12 contracts active simultaneously. The paperwork from that period was never properly organized. I kept meaning to have someone go through it." "You've had the archive for over a decade without organizing it?" He glanced at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "I've been busy, evidently," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the distinct sense that he was recalibrating something. She couldn't have said what. "Good night, Miss Redford," he said. "Good night, Mr. Northwick." She went upstairs with the catalogue under her arm. She sat at the edge of her bed for a long time afterward, not reading, not preparing for the morning, simply sitting. She had come to Brighton Falls expecting a transaction, a clean, cold exchange, her labour for her family's debt, conducted at a professional distance by a man who dealt in contracts the way other men dealt in pleasantries, automatically and without particular investment. She had not expected the book he wasn't reading. She had not expected the firelight on a face that had forgotten, for 10 minutes on a Wednesday evening, to arrange itself into what was required of it. She pressed her hand flat against the quilt and breathed. The document in her trunk was still there. She had checked it that morning out of habit, pressing her fingers along the lining until she felt the thin, firm outline of the paper beneath the fabric. It was still there. It was the only thing she could be certain of. The following week she began the 89 boxes. He had been right. They were extensive. The Callaway Bridge project alone had generated over 90 documents. Correspondence, engineering assessments, cost analyses, subcontractor agreements, and a series of letters between her father's former legal counsel and a man named Gerald Hurst, who appeared to have been Northwick Steel's primary competitor in the rail supply contracts of that period. She did not flag those letters. She read them carefully, twice each, and replaced them in their box in the correct order. And she did not make any notation on her reference sheet, because Gerald Hurst's name appeared in the document sewn into her trunk, and the letters in the 89 box told her something she had not previously understood, that her father had not simply borrowed money from Northwick Steel in 87. He had been positioned between two men. She did not yet know whether he had understood that when he signed. She spent the rest of the week working through the boxes with the methodical attention she always brought to the work, marking what she had been asked to mark, noting what required noting, and keeping her face as clear and composed as the winter garden below the window. On Friday evening, Mr. Aldrich stopped her in the corridor outside the archive. "Mr. Northwick would like to know if you would join him for dinner this evening," he said. "In the dining room at 7. She looked at him. "He asks that I tell you it is not required," Mr. Aldrich added, with the careful neutrality of a man delivering a message whose subtext he had chosen not to examine. "Tell him I'll be there," she said. She arrived at 7. He was already seated at the head of the long dining table, the end nearest the fireplace, with 2 place settings arranged at adjacent corners, close enough for conversation, not close enough to suggest intention. She sat. Mrs. Hale brought the first course without being summoned. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. It was not uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of 2 people who had been existing in the same house for nearly a month without finding a language for it, and who were now sitting close enough that the absence of language had become noticeable. "The Callaway Bridge documents," he said finally. "How many did you find?" 4 in 88. I expect more in 89. There will be." He lifted his water glass. "The project ran into difficulty in 89. Cost overruns, a dispute with the county assessor, a competing bid from Hearst Industrial that nearly won the contract." She kept her eyes on her plate. "I wasn't aware of the competing bid. Most people weren't. It was handled quietly." He paused. "Your father was involved in some of the early assessments. Peripheral involvement. He provided site access through a property he held near the Callaway River. That was the basis of the original agreement. The $17,000, she said. "Yes." She looked up then. He was watching her with the same clear, measuring attention she had first seen across the desk in the study, but there was something different about it tonight. Less evaluative, more present. "You want to know what he told me about it," she said. "I want to know what you know," he said. "There is a difference." The fire crackled between them. Outside, the wind had come up. She could hear it moving against the windows, pressing at the glass with the quiet, persistent insistence of something that intended to get in eventually. "I know more than you think," she said. He set down his glass. "I suspected as much," he said quietly, "since the day you signed." The dinner continued. They spoke of other things. The archive organization, the town, the history of the bridge project in careful, general terms. He asked her once about her father, not about the debt but about the man, and she answered briefly and honestly, and he listened without interrupting, which she had not expected. By the time Mrs. Hale cleared the final course, something had shifted in the room. She could not have named it precisely. It was not warmth, not yet. It was more like the moment when a frozen river begins to move, invisible from the surface, felt only as a low, distant sound beneath the ice. She said goodnight at the door of the dining room. He said goodnight from the table, already opening the folder he had brought with him. She went upstairs. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought about Gerald Hurst's name and her father's signature and the document in the lining of her trunk. And she thought about the way Jasper Northwick had said, "I suspected as much," not with accusation, not with strategy, but with something that sounded, under everything else, like a quiet and complicated kind of hope. She was beginning to understand the man behind the walls, and that was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her since she arrived. The 89 boxes took 3 weeks. Louisa had known they would be extensive. She had not known they would be a map, not a map of steel contracts or bridge assessments or county disputes. Though all of those were there, layered and cross-referenced in the particular way that large financial operations document themselves, each transaction generating the next, each signature creating the conditions for the one that followed. She had catalogued all of that with the careful, methodical attention she brought to everything. But underneath the operational documents, filed without apparent intention in the gaps between quarterly reports and subcontractor agreements, there was another layer entirely. She found the first piece on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week of November. A single letter, handwritten, addressed to Northwick Steel's primary legal counsel in 89, and signed by a man named Warren Cahill. The name meant nothing to her at first. She read the letter twice, noted the reference to the Callaway Bridge contract and set it aside. She found the second piece on Thursday. Another letter, same handwriting, different recipient, this one addressed to the county assessor's office directly. It referenced a property survey. It referenced site access permissions. It referenced, in a single subordinate clause near the end of the second paragraph, a private agreement made in the spring of 87 between Thomas Redford and Gerald Hurst. She set the letter down very carefully on the surface of the desk. Thomas Redford, her father. Gerald Hurst, Northwick Steel's primary competitor. Spring of 87, 3 months before her father had signed the agreement with Northwick Steel. She sat in the archive room for a long time without moving, listening to the house settle around her in the cold morning, listening to the distant sound of a delivery cart on the street below. Then she opened her reference catalogue and wrote nothing. She did not tell him that evening at dinner. They had fallen into a routine of dining together on Tuesdays and Fridays, not by formal arrangement, but by accumulation, the way habits form when two people occupy the same space long enough and the silence between them begins to require something to fill it. The conversations were careful, measured on both sides, but they were real conversations, which was more than she had expected when she arrived. He asked her once about Philadelphia, where she had grown up, and she described it with the selective honesty of someone who had loved a place and then watched it become complicated. He listened. He did not ask follow-up questions, but he did not redirect either, which she had come to understand was his version of genuine attention. She asked him once about the mills, about the early years, about what it had been like to build something from the scale his father had started with to the scale it had become. He answered more than she expected, carefully, without sentiment, but with a specificity that told her the history mattered to him in a way that went beyond ownership. "My father believed that if you built something that lasted," he said, "you didn't need anything else to justify the years." "Do you believe that?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I used to," he said. She did not ask what had changed, but she thought about it on the walk back upstairs, and she thought about it the next morning in the archive, and she thought about it while she was reading Warren Cahill's letters and understanding with increasing clarity that the thing Jasper Northwick had spent his life building was sitting on a foundation that had been deliberately compromised before he had ever laid a single beam. She found the third letter on the following Monday. This one was different. It was not filed in the document boxes. It was folded inside the back cover of a contract ledger from '89, tucked between the ledger's binding and its final page, in a place that suggested it had been put there by someone who expected to retrieve it privately and had never gotten the chance. The letter was addressed to no one. It was written in a hand she did not recognize, not Warren Cahill's careful script, not the angular efficiency of Jasper's own correspondence, not the formal legal hand of the company's counsel. It was her father's handwriting. She knew it instantly. She had grown up reading it on letters and ledger entries, and the small notes he left on her desk when she came into the office early, brief, affectionate, always ending with the same abbreviated signature, the R looping back on itself in the particular way that had been his alone. She read the letter standing up, still holding the ledger, because her legs did not appear to have decided yet whether to sit down. It was not long, 4 paragraphs, written in the tone of a man who was speaking to himself because there was no one else to speak to. Her father had known about the competing agreement with Hearst Industrial before he signed with Northwick Steel. He had not been peripheral to the arrangement, as Jasper had described. He had been the arrangement, the deliberate intermediary, positioned by Hearst to provide site access through the Callaway River property at a price that would make Northwick Steel's bid financially unworkable, while simultaneously appearing to cooperate with Northwick's legal team. He had done it because Hearst had offered him $40,000. He had done it because the Redford family had been closer to ruin than anyone knew, and then he had signed the agreement with Northwick Steel anyway, whether out of guilt or fear or a change of mind she could not determine from the letter, and he had taken the $17,000 from Northwick, and he had paid back Hearst, and he had spent the remaining years of his life sitting on a secret that had ultimately, she understood now, killed him as surely as the heart failure listed on the death certificate. She closed the ledger. She stood at the archive window for a long time, looking out at the winter garden where the first snow of December was beginning to fall, soft, unhurried, covering everything with the same impartial white. Her father had not been a bad man. She believed that. She had known him too well and loved him too completely to revise that belief based on a single letter found in a ledger. But he had done a bad thing, and he had known it, and he had carried it. And now she was standing in the house of the man her father had helped to deceive, in possession of a document that could reopen a decade-old contract dispute worth considerably more than $17,000. The document in her trunk, the one she had found in the correspondence cabinet before she left home. She pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window. That document, the one she had been carrying since before she arrived, was Gerald Hearst's original instruction letter to her father. Signed, dated, and specific. It named the property. It named the amount. It named Northwick Steel by name as the target of the arrangement. It was, in legal terms, evidence of deliberate interference in a competitive contract process. In practical terms, It was a document that could force a full legal review of the Callaway Bridge contract, call into question the legitimacy of every subsequent agreement that had been built on top of it, and expose Northwick Steel to a decade of disputed liability. She had not yet decided whether to give it to him or keep it. She had believed when she arrived that she was protecting her father's memory, that the document was a shield, something that gave her standing in this arrangement, something that kept her from being entirely without leverage. She had not accounted for the possibility that the man she was protecting her father's memory from would turn out to be someone she could not easily categorize as an enemy. He found her in the archive that afternoon. She had not heard him on the stairs. He moved quietly for a large man, or perhaps she had simply been too deep inside her own thoughts to register the sound. She looked up from the catalogue she was not actually reading, and he was standing in the doorway with his coat still on, as though he had come directly from outside. "You've been in here since this morning," he said. "I'm working. It's 4:30. He looked at her with the particular directness that she had stopped finding disconcerting somewhere around the 3rd week. "You look like something's wrong." "I'm fine." He stepped into the room. He looked at the boxes on the shelf, at the open ledger on the desk beside her, at her face in that order. Quickly, precisely, the way he looked at everything. "The 89 boxes," he said. "I'm nearly through them. What did you find?" The question landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Clean, direct, inevitable. She looked at him. He was standing 2 feet from the desk with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes on her, and he was not performing patience or strategic calm. He was simply waiting with the particular quality of someone who has suspected something for a long time and has finally decided he would rather know than not know. "Letters," she said. "Correspondence between Warren Cahill and the county assessor's office from 89. "I know about Warren Cahill," he said. "Then you know about the Hearst arrangement." The room went very quiet. Outside, the snow was still falling. She could hear it against the window. Barely a sound. More of an absence of sound. The way snow quiets a city by covering everything that would normally make noise. "I know there was one," he said. "I don't know the details. My legal team suspected interference with the Callaway bid, but was never able to document it." His voice was even, controlled, but she had spent 6 weeks learning the difference between his public composure and the other kind, and this was not the other kind. This was effort. "I know your father was involved in some capacity." "He was the intermediary," she said. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, the slight stillness that moved through him like a current, the adjustment, the deliberate steadying. "How deeply?" he asked. "Deeply enough," she said, "though I believe he regretted it." He turned slightly, looking at the shelves rather than at her. "That's a generous interpretation. It's an honest one." He said nothing for a long moment. When he turned back, something had changed in his expression. Not anger. She had expected anger or something adjacent to it, and what she saw instead was harder to look at than anger would have been. It was the expression of a man recalculating an entire decade. "Is there documentation?" he asked. She looked at him directly, and she did not answer. Not because she intended to lie, but because she was standing at a threshold she had been approaching for 6 weeks, and she could see clearly what was on both sides of it. The version where she gave him everything and became entirely transparent, a person with no remaining protection, and the version where she kept the document and maintained the only leverage she had ever had in this arrangement. He was watching her face. "Miss Redford," he said quietly. "There may be," she said. "I need time." The silence between them had weight now. Not the comfortable weight of shared evenings by the fire, not the productive weight of 2 people working in parallel. This was the weight of something that had finally surfaced and could not be made to submerge again. "How much time followed?" he asked. "A few days." He held her gaze for a moment longer. Then he nodded once and walked to the door. He stopped in the doorway without turning around. "Whatever you found," he said, "whatever your reasons for keeping it, I want you to understand that what happens next will affect more than the company." His voice was low and entirely steady. "There are 460 men employed in those mills. Their families live in this town. Whatever your father did or didn't do, those men had nothing to do with it." He walked out. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, measured and unhurried, until they faded into the lower floors of the house. She sat alone in the archive room with the snow falling outside and the ledger open on the desk beside her, and the memory of 460 men she had never met pressing against her chest like a hand. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket. She touched the letter she had carried there every day since she left home. Not the one from Northwick Steel, the other one. The one that was not in her trunk, but on her person, because she had never trusted a locked room the way she trusted the space closest to her own body. Gerald Hurst's instruction letter. She held it without taking it out. She had 3 days. And for the first time since she arrived in Brighton Falls, she was no longer certain which outcome she was hoping for. The 3 days passed like held breath. Louisa did not go back to the archive. She told Mr. Aldrich she needed time to organize her reference notes, which was true enough to say without being the reason. She spent the first day in her room with the door closed, and Gerald Hurst's letter on the writing desk in front of her, reading it until the words stopped being words and became simply marks on paper, the residue of a decision her father had made before she was old enough to understand what decisions cost. She spent the second day walking. Brighton Falls in December was a particular kind of beautiful, severe and honest, the kind of beauty that doesn't ask you to feel anything specific about it. She walked the commercial streets and the river road and the long path along the eastern edge of town where the mill complex stood, its chimneys running even in the cold, their smoke rising straight up into the grey sky. She stood at the fence line and looked at the buildings and thought about 460 men, whose names she would never know, who came to work each morning inside something that Jasper Northwick had spent his life constructing, and that her father had helped to quietly undermine a decade ago. On the third morning she came downstairs at 7 o'clock and knocked on the study door. He was already there. He was always already there. "Come in," he said. She set 2 documents on the desk. The first was Gerald Hurst's instruction letter, the original signed and dated spring of '87, naming Thomas Redford as intermediary, naming Northwick Steel as the target, naming the Callaway River property, and the amount and the intended outcome, with the unambiguous clarity of a man who had believed, when he wrote it, that it would never be seen by anyone who mattered. The second was her father's letter, the one from the ledger. 4 paragraphs in a looping hand. A man speaking to himself in the only private space he had left. She placed them side by side and stepped back. Jasper looked at them. He did not reach for them immediately. He looked at her first. "Both of them," he said. "Both of them," she said. He picked up Hurst's letter. He read it slowly, with the complete attention he gave to everything. No rushing, no visible reaction, simply a man reading a document and understanding what it contained. Then he set it down and picked up her father's letter, and read that too. When he finished, he placed it carefully beside the first and looked at the surface of the desk for a moment without speaking. "You've had these since before you arrived," he said. "Hurst's letter, yes. I found it in my father's correspondence cabinet 3 weeks after he died. Your father's letter I found in the archive ledger. You came here already knowing." "I came here knowing part of it," she said. "I didn't know my father had written it down." He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the morning was clear and very cold, the first real cold of the winter, the kind that makes the air feel sharp and exact. "Why are you giving them to me now?" he asked. It was a real question. Not rhetorical, not strategic. He genuinely wanted to know. She had spent 3 days preparing for many versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for the version where he asked her that in that tone, as though her reason mattered more than the documents themselves. "Because keeping them was protecting a version of my father that those letters don't actually support," she said. "And because you were right about the men in those mills, they have nothing to do with what happened in '87. He looked at her. "That's the whole reason?" he said. She held his gaze. "No," she said. "But it's the reason I'm willing to say out loud." Something moved through his expression. Not quite the relief she had seen on the day she signed the contract, but related to it. Deeper, maybe. Less controlled. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out at the street, at the bare elms and the iron fence and the pale sky beyond. "Hurst has been trying to reopen the Callaway dispute for 3 years, he said. "He doesn't have documentation. He never did because he trusted your father to destroy his copy of that letter. With this," he stopped. "With this, his legal position collapses entirely. The dispute closes. Permanently." "I know," she said. "The debt," he said. "The $17,000. "I'm not here about the debt," she said. He turned from the window. She had said it simply, without emphasis, because it was simply true. She had stopped being there about the debt sometime around the 3rd week, and they had both known it for longer than either of them had said. He crossed the room and stood on the other side of the desk, looking at her with the direct, unguarded attention that she had seen only in unguarded moments. The man in the armchair with the unread book. The man who had said, "I used to believe that," and left the rest of the sentence open like a door. "The year isn't finished," he said. "You have 6 months remaining on the agreement. I'm aware." "I'm not asking you to leave," he said. He said it carefully, each word considered, the way he said things that mattered. "I want to be clear about that." She looked at him across the width of the desk, the same desk where she had signed her name 3 months ago on a document she had read to the final line, the same desk where he had handed her a pen with the expression of a man who had been hoping for something he didn't know how to ask for. "I know," she said. "The archive work," he said. "It's real work. It's needed. I know that too. And the—" He stopped. He looked for a fraction of a second like a man who had built very precise language around everything in his life and had arrived at the single thing the language didn't fit. "The dinners," he said. "Tuesday and Friday. I'd like to continue them." She was quiet for a moment. "So would I," she said. He nodded. He looked down at the 2 letters on the desk between them. Her father's admission and Gerald Hurst's exposure, side by side on the oak surface, waiting. "Your father made a bad choice," he said, "and then he made a different one." He paused. That matters. She hadn't known until he said it, how much she had needed to hear it said by exactly this man in exactly this room. She didn't let it show. Not fully. Not in a way that would require either of them to navigate it directly. But she did not look away either. "I'll have the legal team review both documents this week," he said. "The Hurst dispute will be resolved before the new year." "And the debt?" He looked at her steadily. "Cleared. As of today." "That wasn't the arrangement." "The arrangement," he said, "required you to turn over any documents from your father's archive related to the original contract. You've done that." He picked up both letters and squared them against the desk surface with the practiced efficiency of a man who settled matters completely once he settled them at all. "The terms have been met." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter she had pressed her thumb against for 47 readings on a hired coach in the dark, and the woman who had stepped through an iron gate with a single trunk and a secret sewn into the lining. Certain that she understood exactly what she was walking into, she had not understood anything. "All right," she said. She turned toward the door. "Miss Redford." She stopped. She turned back. He was standing behind the desk with his hands at his sides and his expression entirely open, in the way it almost never was, in the way she had seen it only in the spaces between things, between sentences, between rooms, between the version of himself he presented to Brighton Falls and whatever was underneath it. "Thank you," he said, "for bringing them to me." She considered him for a moment. The man who had built an empire on a compromised foundation and not known it, who ran his house like a document and his silences like a second language, who had asked her to stay, not because the archive required it, but because Tuesday and Friday had become the steadiest hours in a life she was only beginning to understand, had been very lonely for a very long time. "You're welcome," she said. She walked out of the study and down the corridor and up the stairs to the archive room, where the 89 boxes were nearly finished, and the winter light came through the window at a low, clear angle that made everything look exact. She sat down at the desk. She opened the catalogue. She began to work. Downstairs, Jasper Northwick sat at his desk for a long time without opening a single folder. He picked up the pen she had used to sign the agreement 3 months ago. He had not moved it, he realized, not once. And he set it down again. The empire was intact. Gerald Hurst would be finished by spring. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately name, the house did not feel like a machine that happened to have rooms in it. He pulled the folder open. He read the final line, and he left it for once unsigned, because some things he was learning did not need to be executed immediately to be real.